Hello, my friends. You are going to love my guest today. He is a national correspondent for Bloomberg Businessweek. He's a big deal. He is a big political writer, author, and he wrote the New York Times bestseller Devil's Bargain, which is about the Steve Bannon and the rise of the right-wing populist uprising that obviously produced Donald Trump. Well, his new book that I'm talking to him about today, it's called The Rebels, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and the struggle for a new American politics. Fascinating story, super important, a masterful account of one of our era's defining political sagas. And Joshua Green joins me today starting at 23 minutes into the show today. But first, the news. Got a whole bunch of stories, headlines, and sound coming at you in just a moment. Wanted to give you a heads up that I will be hosting the first ever official Stand Up with Pete Dominick gathering in Las Vegas, March 22nd and 23rd. And I will be performing along with some of my friends. John Carroll headlining that night, the amazing singer and songwriter who is a huge part of our community and wrote and performs our theme song each and every day here on the show. That made it sound like he comes in the shed and performs it for me. He did, actually, one time. It was amazing. But he will be there along with comedians J.L. Covan, Ophira Eisenberg, and Christian Finnegan. Looks like Gareth Sever is going to join us from Buckets and Boards, another one of our favorites in our community, and a whole bunch more. I know of you are coming. The ticket link is now live. The Stand Up Pod Jam, podcast, comedy, music, and more. Get your flights now. If you want to come out, hang out, go for a run, a hike, have a drink, a coffee, whatever, I really hope that you will consider joining us. Thank you to Cassie in Las Vegas for making all this happen. Get your tickets, your flights. We'll have a book of rooms as well, discounted rate rooms for stand-up listeners and subscribers. Find out more, patreon.com/Pete Dominick, and I hope to see you in Las Vegas. All right, Joshua Green coming up. I've got some sound for you, but here are the most important headlines outside of the extreme weather that I've gathered for you here on today's news recap from the last 24 hours. First and foremost, I guess, important to look at the last year at least one more time for a very, very important reason. Headlines yesterday, 2023 shattered records to become the hottest year. Month after month, global temperatures didn't just break records, they surpassed them by far. This year could be even warmer. The news continues to look bad as global temperatures started blowing past records mid-year and didn't stop. First, June was the planet's warmest June on record. Then July was the warmest July, and so on all the way through December. That comes as no surprise to climate scientists who say that unabated emissions of greenhouse gases cause global warming to reach new highs. Scientists caution that a single year, even one as exceptional as 2023, can tell us only so much about how the planet's long-term warming might be changing, but other signs suggest, of course, the planet is heating up more quickly than before. Read all about it at any number of reliable news sources with great journalists reporting on this new evidence, and you're going to see more coming out over the next couple of weeks because NASA, NOAA, Berkeley Earth Research Group all scheduled to release their own estimates later this week. All right, that is probably what I think is the most important headline because, it's the planet. Another big story yesterday, though, was that former disgraced President Donald Trump appeared in front of an appeals court in Washington to argue that he's immune from prosecution on charges of plotting to overturn the 2020 election because they arose from actions he took as president, which makes no sense. Of course, remember when we tried to impeach him, the Republican Senate Majority Leader said we shouldn't be impeaching the president while he's still the president. If he committed crimes, he can face them when he's no longer president. And now, of course, they're walking that back. But all three judges who heard the Trump appeal seemed pretty skeptical, according to pretty much everybody who watches that. Some people said a lot harsher things. Of course, the panel appeared particularly wary when Trump's lawyer said that during the hearing that a president could assassinate a political rival and still be shielded from prosecution unless the Senate first convicted him at an impeachment proceeding. The New York Times says the judges look torn at times about how broadly they might rule. One suggested that a decision to deny immunity could result in a flood of partisan prosecutions of former presidents. So much more to read about that decision, but the appeals court expected to make its ruling fairly quickly. Regardless of the decision, of course, the issue of immunity is likely to reach the Supreme Court, where the justices will determine not only whether the case goes to trial, but when. Trump has been trying to push the trial back until after the 2024 election so he can become dictator for life, of course. In a related story, apparently the special counsel Jack Smith, who's overseeing the prosecution of former President Donald Trump in 2 federal cases, was the target of an attempted swatting at his Maryland residence on Christmas Day. That's when somebody calls the police and says there's a crime or something happening at this or that address. And, of course, that is highly illegal and apparently very easy to do. And apparently everybody is getting swatted, prominent people in government and politics especially. It's a real scary thing. And generally speaking, it sounds like law enforcement is handling it fairly well. That's got to be a scary thing to walk into for all parties. But so they wanted to mention how scary it must be to be Jack Smith every day. Something tells me he's not going to be intimidated. I'll have some sound from the hearing and some analysis from Chris Hayes coming up in a minute, but more headlines. Crazy story coming out of Ecuador where there was mass chaos as a powerful gang leader disappeared from jail. Uprisings broke out in several prisons and masked men took television anchors hostage. Really crazy story in South America and Ecuador. In Israel, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is trying to persuade Israeli government leaders to exercise more restraint in Gaza. How's that going for you? Floating the prospect of normalized relations with Saudi Arabia. Secretary Blinken warned Israel to, quote, stop taking steps that undercut the Palestinians' ability to govern themselves effectively. Israel's military took responsibility for the death of another Hezbollah leader today, saying the IDF killed Ali Hussein Barji, commander of the organization's aerial unit in southern Lebanon. The NRA trial has begun for Wayne LaPierre, who has got a notion of blood on his hands, of course. They're saying the National Rifle Association is the victim of betrayal, and they're seeking to distinguish the longtime leader from the gun rights group during opening arguments in the civil trial against it and its executives. Good luck with that. In one of the biggest scandals of the Biden administration, Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin was diagnosed with prostate cancer in December and underwent a minimally invasive procedure to treat it and cure it. But they didn't tell anybody. And then he was in the hospital and didn't know where he was. And it's a really big deal for the Biden administration. And can you imagine if something like that happened when the last guy was president? Now let's go back overseas, where in France, the president named a new prime minister, and he's a young man. He's 34, and apparently he is the first openly gay prime minister and the country's youngest prime minister ever. And those are your headlines for today. Now let's get to some of that sound I have for you, starting with what I was referring to from MSNBC Chris Hayes' show, and pretty much every other news outlet yesterday played some or a lot of the audio from President Trump's appearance at an appeals court in Washington yesterday to argue that, of course, he should be immune from prosecution on charges of plotting to overturn the 2020 election because they arose from actions that he took as president. Well, listen to this analysis and the audio from Chris Hayes on MSNBC last night.
Week before the Iowa caucus, the man who's poised to win the Republican nomination sat in court while his lawyers attempted a last-minute effort to get the ex-president's criminal charges thrown out on immunity grounds. In Donald Trump's federal election interference trial, one of the last chances to hold him accountable for the crimes of January 6th before the upcoming election, his lawyers stood before the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, probably the second most important court in all the land, and before the nation and those 3 judges argued that a president can effectively do whatever he wants, no matter how malevolent, without any legal consequences.
To authorize the prosecution of a president for his official acts would open a Pandora's box from which this nation may never recover.
So can I explore sort of the implications of what you're arguing? I understand your position to be that a president is immune from criminal prosecution for any official act that he takes as president, even if that action is taken for an unlawful or unconstitutional purpose. Is that correct?
With an important exception, which is that if the president is impeached and convicted by the United States Senate in a, proceeding that reflects, widespread political consensus.
Okay, so there you have it, in case you weren't tracking. So the official position of Donald Trump is that as long as he or any president can hold on to 35 votes in the Senate to avoid impeachment conviction, there can be no, as a matter of constitutional bedrock American law, there can be no criminal accountability for anything he does, no matter how violent or evil. Even as his lawyer was forced to concede having his political opponents murdered.
Could a president order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival? That's an official act in order to SEAL Team 6?
He would have to be and would speedily be, impeached and convicted before the criminal prosecution.
What if he weren't? There would be no criminal prosecution, no criminal liability for that?
Chief Justice's opinion in Marbury against Madison and our constitutional tradition and the plain language of the impeachment judgment clause all clearly presuppose that what the founders were concerned about was not.
I asked you a yes or no question. Could a president who ordered SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival who was not impeached, would he be subject to criminal prosecution?
If he were impeached and convicted first. And
so your answer is no.
My answer is qualified yes. There's a political process that would have to occur under the structure of our Constitution, which would require impeachment and conviction by the Senate.
Again, all you got to do is hold on to 35 votes. You hold on to 35 votes in the Senate and you can have your political opponents murdered. You can have anyone murdered. You could do whatever you want. You got 35 votes in the Senate and there is nothing anyone can do anywhere in this country under the structure they say of the Constitution. They are not trying to hide it. Trump's argument is some of the most breathtaking, aggressive public articulation of a vision of American dictatorship as we have ever seen.
Yeah, really hard to argue with. Great analysis from Chris Hayes, as usual, on MSNBC last night. But they also played the lawyer from Jack Smith's team making the arguments against the absurdity that you just heard. And I thought this was pretty good, too. So here's more from yesterday's hearing.
Now, the lawyer for Special Counsel Jack Smith's office did an admirable job both outlining how ridiculous the ever-shifting legal argument from Trump is, and also, again, to reiterate the very dire consequences that could follow from this preposterous theory of presidential immunity if adopted.
And the defendant's theory over the course of this litigation has evolved a bit. And I think now before this court, I understand the argument to be principally sort of a principal submission to be, as you just described, this, what we call in our brief, the conditioned precedent argument, that there is only liability, criminal liability for a former president if that president has been impeached and convicted. And that is wrong for textual, structural, historical reasons, and a host of practical ones, one of which I'll start with, again, to just amplify the point. It would mean that if a former president engages in assassination, selling pardons, these kinds of things, and then isn't impeached and convicted, there is no accountability for that individual. And that is frightening.
A lawyer from Smith's office also noted that while the criminal prosecution of a former president is unprecedented, so were Trump's crimes against American democracy.
Never before has there been allegations that a sitting president has, with private individuals and using the levers of power, sought to fundamentally subvert the democratic republic and the electoral system. And frankly, if that kind of fact pattern arises again, I think it would be awfully scary if there weren't some sort of mechanism by which to reach that criminally.
All right, there you have it. Now, a little bit more analysis. Hours after those arguments were made, Jamie Raskin, Democratic congressman, appeared on CNN with Wolf Blitzer. He noted that a Senate conviction that we just heard being a precondition for a criminal prosecution gives a sitting president incentive to assassinate senators inclined to vote to convict him, which is a pretty interesting argument. Here's that.
The presentation in the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals before the three-judge panel was astounding. Donald Trump and his lawyers essentially asserted that the president has the right to assassinate people, to kill people, without any prospect of prosecution unless they're first impeached by the House and convicted in the Senate. And of course, as a member of Congress, my first thought was, well, then if the president is going to order out for the assassination of his political rivals and say there's a narrow margin in the Senate of a 2 or 3 vote in the opposition party, what's to keep him from murdering members of the Senate to make sure that he doesn't get convicted there in order to deny a 2/3 majority? He could kill them and then He can't be impeached or convicted because he's murdered his opposition, and he can't be prosecuted for it because he hasn't been impeached or convicted. Now, of course, Trump's argument is utterly ludicrous. Nobody's ever even attempted such an absurd argument in American history, but it shows you how outlandish and deranged Donald Trump's worldview is at this point. And it's very dangerous because all of it revolves around political violence.
Great analysis from the Democratic congressman from Maryland on CNN, and even Fox News wasn't having it. Fox News legal analyst Jonathan Turley told the network's viewers on Tuesday that Donald Trump's latest legal argument doesn't pass the smell test. But then he started to hedge and try to have it both ways and said that it was debatable. Listen to this squirreliness.
Is that the case, Jonathan? Can a president, under certain circumstances, order the assassination of a political rival and receive immunity for it?
I don't believe it is the case. This was really, I think, very illustrative of how the argument went. It was a series of jump scares. Both sides were presenting these parades of horribles that would come if you don't accept our argument. I think what was clear to me from the argument was that probably Trump's this argument of impeachment first, prosecution later is a dead letter with the panel. I don't believe that the judges agreed that you needed a conviction to ever prosecute a president. But there's still a lot of ambiguity there. The question is what the court described in Nixon versus Fitzgerald as the outer parameters of presidential authority or duties. And the question is, does this fit within that gray area? Because the Supreme Court and the lower courts have struggled for this, and it's not clear. And so there's legitimate debate here. I did not come away thinking the panel was likely to rule with the former president. At some points, they seem to be debating more as to whether I'm going to use a sledgehammer or a stiletto. I mean, they were arguing what is the best grounds for getting rid of this appeal. But, we really don't know, and time will tell. But what is clear is that it won't take much time.
Oh, that Jonathan Turley is so insufferable, his framing of that situation. Not being honest with the viewers. I mean, he can't possibly believe that. All right, well, let's leave that issue alone, move on to something else. I thought this was pretty provocative. During an interview with CNN International's Christian Amanpour, an Israeli journalist from Haaretz named Gideon Levy slammed the Bibi Netanyahu government for setting no limits to the bombing campaign in Gaza and for now simply killing for the purpose of killing. Gideon Levy writes a column for the Haaretz. It's a liberal Israeli newspaper, and he's won human rights awards for reporting on Palestinian suffering, but I thought this was real provocative and wanted to share it with you.
I just asked you, to explain what you said yourself. There is no answer for this conduct. What do you exactly mean by that?
Look, by the time we will finish this interview, another baby will be killed in Gaza. By the time that you will finish your show, there will be another 2 women killed in Gaza. How long can this last? Israel had the full right to go for this campaign, for this war, but there must be limits, and we crossed them so long time ago. But above all, answering your question, where do we aim to? What will it be any better for Israel's security if another 20,000 Palestinians will be killed in Gaza, if another 500,000 people will lose their homes? What does this contribute for the security of Israel? We have to realize that the goals that Israel had declared are unachievable, or at least partly unachievable. And we should concentrate now about creating a new reality and not killing and killing for the purpose of killing.
There you go. Gideon Levy of Haaretz on CNN International with Christian Amanpour. And one more depressing clip. This is a trigger alert. It is a very, very brief moment from the disgraced former president yesterday, who was taking a couple of questions. And there was a lot made of this because he says, "Thank you very much." And he starts walking away. And you hear what a reporter yells out. And the former president just ignores the question and keeps walking.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, you just used the word bedlam. Will you tell your supporters now, no matter what, no violence?
Nothing. No, he won't say anything. He just kept walking, and everybody made a big deal of that yesterday. because of course he wants violence. Is there any question that he wants violence, that he condones it, that he encourages it? Is that debatable? Do you think I'm being too hyperbolic? Of course he wants violence. He loved the violence on January 6th. He sat there and watched it on TV in hopes they would succeed in preventing the certification of Joe Biden, and so that he could stay there and throw ketchup on the walls. And one more clip of the former disgraced president, just in case you didn't hear this. Here he is rooting for an economic crash before he gets to be president again.
When there's a crash, I hope it's going to be during this next 12 months, because I don't want to be Herbert Hoover. The one president, I just don't want to be Herbert Hoover.
All right. Well, I think all the rest of the presidents just don't want to be you. And that goes for all of the countries around the world. All right, now for a little lighthearted ending of the news segment, let's go to Jimmy Kimmel, who was back alive and really went after Aaron Rodgers in his opening monologue. Here's his edited version of some of his remarks.
Aaron Rodgers has a very high opinion of himself. Because he had success on the football field, he believes himself to be an extraordinary being. He genuinely thinks that because God gave him the ability to throw a ball, he's smarter than everyone else. They let him host Jeopardy for 2 weeks. Now he knows everything. Congratulations to Aaron Rodgers, who has done the impossible. He made the New York Jets look even worse. Did you hear this story about me and Aaron Rodgers? Now, he went on a show on ESPN, the Pat McAfee show, and out of the blue insinuated that I was nervous because the Jeffrey Epstein list was coming out. And then it did come out, and of course my name wasn't on it, and isn't on it and won't ever be on. I don't know Jeffrey Epstein. I've never met Jeffrey Epstein. I think Aaron Rodgers has the right to express any opinion he wants to, but saying someone is a pedophile is not an opinion, nor is it trash talk. Sorry, Pat McAfee. Aaron Rodgers, who I guess believes one of two things. Either he actually believes my name was going to be on Epstein's list, which is insane, or the more likely scenario is he doesn't actually believe that. He just said it because he's mad at me for making fun of his top knot and his lies about being vaccinated.
All right, well, there you go, Jimmy Kimmel last night, and that is the news here on Stand Up each and every day, Monday through Thursday, and I might start doing it on Fridays as well now. We'll see. I did it last Friday, but I'm putting out shows Monday through Saturday, but the news segment I always try to get to with all those headlines and sound clips for about 20 minutes Monday through Thursday. So tell your friends that listening to Stand Up with Pete Dominick, you get the most comprehensive look at the headlines from the last 24 hours, and a great smart guest will join us to help work through our problems in the world and in our lives on this journey together. And today I've got a first-timer. He's not been on the show before, and he's a real smart cat. He's a very well-respected political writer, journalist, and author, a New York Times best-selling author for his book Devil's Bargain, which chronicled how Steve Bannon and Donald Trump led a right-wing populist uprising that produced the biggest upset in U.S. presidential history. Well, in his new book, The Rebels, he gives an epic account of how the parallel struggle that has played out on the left since the global financial collapse of 2008. Joshua Green tracks the rise of economic populism in the Democratic Party through the interwoven stories of three outsiders who emerged in the wake of the crash to lead the charge, driving changes on the left that have proven improbably every bit as profound as those that Trump had driven on the right, according to Joshua Green. He, of course, is a national correspondent for Bloomberg Businessweek. He's written for The New Yorker, The Atlantic, Vanity Fair, and he's appeared on Real Time with Bill Maher, PBS's Frontline, CNN, all of the shows. Joshua Green joins me now to talk about his new book, The Rebels. This interview is also posted on YouTube, youtube.com/standupwithpete. Please go subscribe to that, and welcome to the program for the first time ever, Joshua Green. Please let him know you heard him. Let's do it. Joshua Green is here. The new book is out. I'll throw it up on the screen. Everybody's got to go get it because it explains so much of what you need to know. Congratulations. This could not have been easy. Thank you for joining me, Josh.
Thank you, Pete. No, it was like sawing off my own arm writing this thing. A little bit overdue.
A little bit overdue, but really, really important. Not unlike all of your work. Your last book, of course, a New York Times bestseller about our mutual good, close friend, my kid's godfather, Steve Bannon.
Yeah. I mean, I'd spent the last presidential cycle, 15, 16, kind of embedded with the right wingers and wrote a book about right-wing populism. And, this one is really about kind of left-wing populism. And I kind of come out of the lefty policy world, like originally as a journalist. I worked at the American Prospect, like in the Washington Monthly. I'd known Elizabeth Warren back when I was like a Boston Globe columnist. So this is the story that's kind of near and dear to my heart. The Trump one took precedence first because nobody really expected him to get elected. But this is sort of the deep history of the rise of the populist left since like 2008 financial crisis.
And it's really good. It also starts with Jimmy Carter, which a lot of that, almost all of it, I didn't know. And I thought I knew a little bit about most of what you're writing about because I covered it for years at SiriusXM. But there's so much that I didn't know. And I want to talk to you about it. But real quick, Josh, I heard your appearance on the Adam Carolla show, which is a huge show. You got to do it. But I mean, he was pretty hostile. You handled it well. It didn't get ugly or personal or anything, but he had you there. And I thought, oh my God, this guy doing this interview on this book, doing a great interview straight up. I think I got a couple questions, but you're going to get some shit, some threats, some things. And so is Carolla. And you did. What was that like? What did you hear from his listeners? Why do that show?
I mean, it was funny. It was a combination of, you're a gay commie, pinko, lefty, whatever, kind of uncreative. But the interesting kind of strain I got was angry Carolla listeners being like, "Hey, why was he agreeing with you so much? Like you're like changing his politics or something." A little bit of a stretch, but I mean, look, it was a good discussion. I mean, as a journalist, I have a kind of kind of anthropologist gene. I think I like hanging out with guys on the right wing who I don't necessarily agree with politically. I like provoking them and being provoked. I kind of like the back and forth. I used to be a fan of the Man Show back in the day when Carolla and Kimmel were doing that.
Rogan,
I'm not too proud to admit it, not too woke to be a little ashamed of that, but I was. And so, when they reached out, I'm like, I love to do the show. And I'd love to mix it up with you. And it was a lot of fun, even if some of his listeners got a little sore about what I had to say in the new book. But the weird thing on that show is, I mean, you could tell I had people coming out of the blue in my normal life, friends, relatives, whatever, that I did not think were political listeners, that I definitely did not think were Carolla listeners who were like, "Oh, hey, I heard you on Carolla and I went out and bought the new book." So, I guess mission accomplished.
No, I think you should always, it's a huge show. And I think you should always do those shows. I mean, would there be a show that has invited you that you would turn down outside of somebody that might not have like the reach? You got you got a lot of demand in your time right now. You're sitting down with Chuck Todd, for God's sake. Next week, you've sat down with Tim Miller, which is a great conversation. But would you say no to like, I don't know, Hannity or something?
I'd have to think, though. No, I've had great conversations with Hannity, although his handler called me up and got mad at me because I did a little piece on the Trump coast and mentioned that, like, Hannity is such a suck-up that he bought a house, like, right up the street from Mar-a-Lago. And so we had a little falling out about that. But, no, I'd be happy to do Hannity's show if he called. And, like, look, why not? I mean, the book is an interesting story. It's not a kind of rah-rah cheerleading book from the left. I mean, it's a serious history of the rise of kind of this brand of populism. And as I wrote about in Devil's Bargain, my last book on the right, and as I write about in The Rebels, like this is something that's kind of important to American politics in both parties. We saw that backlash completely change establishment politics on the right and eventually give rise to Donald Trump. And the story that I've been waiting to tell, that I tell in this book, is about how it had a kind of similar phenomenon on the right, and it kind of gave rise to this brand of lefty populism. First through Warren, she's my first character, then Bernie, then AOC, but that really hadn't existed for a few decades in Democratic politics before that, because people really hadn't been keyed in on things like economics and the banks and financial regulations and all that stuff, for the 20, 30, 40 years prior to that. And it was that history, the kind of rise of Wall Street and its takeover of the Democratic Party, that I've always been interested in. I mean, I work at Businessweek, so I kind of work in the intersection of politics and finance. But, even hanging around with like Elizabeth Warren and Tim Geithner back in, 2009, which is where the kind of hard reporting for this book really starts, it was just so interesting. I mean, you could see something happening there that like Washington just didn't get. Like, people were so angry about these bank bailouts. And it was clear that there was going to be this kind of backlash. Nobody, least of all me, imagined it would be quite as big or last quite as long as it did and kind of lead to Donald Trump. But on the left, I mean, I had a front row seat watching as like Warren rose from obscure college professor and TARP oversight cop, that was kind of the bailout, to, hugely popular movement leading senator, presidential candidate, then Bernie, then AOC. And it was a history that, like, I just think is like an important one, kind of modern American political history. And so I wanted to write that. I wanted to write that story.
Yeah, it's so important that we talk about the things that happened in our lifetime, especially, I think, because that's what we remember, that where people and organizations and politicians, government, were not held accountable for the things they did wrong. I feel like that's a lot of the story of America in our lifetime, Joshua. And, you know, as I came of age, became a parent and moved to the suburbs, I bought a house, and a month later, the entire global financial system collapsed, as we know. I bought my house in like 2007, early 2007. Maybe it was a little longer than that, actually.
There, right?
Yeah, it was horrible for me and my generation of home buyers and Americans.
Same.
And you go deep on this book. It's almost like, to me, it's like, we can't forget about that. We can't forget about Iraq either. Either of those. No one was really held accountable for either of those things. And now if Trump isn't held accountable for his crimes, it only gets us further down the road into whatever you want to describe it as. I know how I feel about it. But the point is, you go back to the global financial crisis. You examine it, especially on the left, where Democrats were, starting all the way back with Jimmy Carter. So I just want to say it's so important that you go back to 2008, and nobody's doing that enough. I guess my question is why? Why focus so much on that? Because my feeling is people still don't know who to blame for that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And the answer to that is that kind of my instinct or my interest as like a reporter and author, as I'm kind of out in Washington, out in the world, hanging around with all these characters, watching the news unfold, is why? Like, why are things turning out this way? Why is there this huge financial crisis? How come? Now, I was embedded with Tim Geithner back in 2009 when I worked at The Atlantic for a big profile. So I had this like up close view of him trying to kind of
he was Obama's Treasury Secretary.
Yeah. Obama's Treasury Secretary, who, along with Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, Obama, were kind of at the front lines, like battling the fallout from this crisis. And this was at the time when all of this taxpayer money was going to bail out Wall Street. And I mean, it was bizarre. It made no sense to me. I mean, Geithner had a very clear theory of the case, why we're doing this, why we're not helping people with their mortgages. And in his mind, there was a kind of internal logic, which I talked to about in the book. But even way back then, in my other life, hanging around with Elizabeth Warren for the Boston Globe, or being out on the campaign trail, or kind of at events in normal America around the country, you could see this kind of rising wave of anger. So to me, the original impetus for the book was to write about the history of Wall Street and the Democratic Party, how it was that the party first kind of sunk its claws into Democrats to such an extent that would lead to the kind of bailout that we saw in 2008. And the answer to that question took me all the way back to 1978 and the Jimmy Carter White House, and sort of the first chapter in the book. But really, Carter was dealing with a lot of things similar to what Joe Biden is dealing with now, much worse, but inflation. At the time for Carter, it was a very lousy economy. People were unhappy and angry. And Democrats, they were out of ideas. They'd long been the party of labor. But union membership was in decline. The party really didn't know which way to go. And Carter, I think, almost out of desperation, Carter and Democrats turned to a lot of Wall Street folks who had this kind of magical elixir. They called it capital formation. You and I would know it as kind of supply side economics that said, look, let's just massive tax cuts for banks and rich people, and it'll create this wave of job growth that will turn the economy around. And it didn't for Jimmy Carter. When he lost and when he got pummeled by Ronald Reagan in 1980, Democrats reacted the way they do, by panicking and running in the other direction. So you have the rise of new Democrats, of neoliberalism, of people like Bill Clinton, who, for better or worse, just embraced this kind of market forward logic that eventually led us to the party of 2007 and 2008 that was hand in hand with the banks, helped to bring about the financial crisis, and then wasn't able to produce a satisfying recovery for the middle class when they needed to. And to me, that is the origin of the rise of Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, AOC, and the movement that they represent.
So much of being president or being an elected leader has to do with the timing of the economy, things that you can't control at all. It was hilarious and awful to hear former disgraced President Donald Trump say yesterday I hope we don't have, a total recession before I'm elected. It's like things that you can control. But there are policies to a certain extent that you can control. And one of them is obviously one of the most boring things to talk about, and probably one of the most important issues in all of economics is tax policy. I had no idea about Carter's ethical and moral ideas about taxes, and the fact that President Carter, wanted to throw out the tax code and start over. More importantly, until reading your book, I didn't realize it was already so slanted towards the wealthy at that point. I thought for some reason that started to happen later. How much of the story do you think is tax policy?
I think that's a big part of it because, look, rich people, banks, financial companies, that's really where they want to go, right? That is the way that you can kind of rig the game in your favor is through the U.S. tax code. And more often than not, people just aren't paying attention or don't see kind of what's happening in plain sight until there is some kind of blow up like the financial crisis or the COVID crash, and then everybody gets mad about it. But the thing that was so interesting about Carter to me, I went back and did a bunch of archival research, was that, Carter was a Baptist, as we all remember. But he was also a Southern populist in his own way. I mean, he was morally upset about the fact that the tax code skewed so heavily to the wealthy. And he had this kind of wonderful, resonant example of it that I kind of write about in the first chapter of the book, the 3-martini lunch, the 3-martini tax break. And the thing that pissed off Carter was that businessmen who back in the 70s, like you just go out and get sloshed for lunch and, charge it to your credit card. And then you could turn around and take a tax deduction. So essentially, taxpayers were subsidizing rich businessmen's lunchtime drinking. But, a truck driver or a factory worker, a teacher, or just a kind of working class journalist obviously didn't get anything like the same thing. And so Carter's idea was, you know what, I'm going to roll up my sleeves, zero out the tax code, rebuild it from scratch in a way that does away with all these capital gains cuts and all the things that favor the rich. We're going to build a new equitable tax code. And what happened in a nutshell is Carter wasn't very good at politics. Democrats completely got rolled by Wall Street, by business groups, and wound up kind of buying a bill of goods that changed the trajectory of kind of the party in the way it went about its goals. Like, it didn't turn them into like kind of cartoon figures taking money from Wall Street. What it did was it kind of changed the ideological outlook for Democrats who said, still care about working people. We're still socially liberal. But the way for us to achieve those goals is to kind of fall back and let free markets take the lead. That's the way to kind of achieve these things and not do it directly through the government, through laws, through regulations. That worked for a time until it stopped working. And I think the backlash we've seen since 2008, both through the rise of my characters, but especially through Joe Biden's presidency, shows that the pendulum has kind of swung back. That people in both parties, but especially Democrats, have mostly rejected this idea of free market neoliberalism. And now we have this kind of new populist inflected left politics that's going to do battle with the right wing Trump populist that Trump represents in November. And I think, whoever wins that election is probably going to pave the path forward for better or worse when it comes to populist politics.
The first chapter that you mentioned about Carter is worth buying the book alone. I hadn't seen anybody document that, certainly not the way that you have. It's really important. I honestly, I've interviewed so many authors and read so much history, and I haven't. If I ever read about this, I don't remember it. So buy the Rebels just for that chapter, and stay for the deep dives into Elizabeth Warren, AOC, and Bernie Sanders, all who matter so much, all the way up and obviously to the Biden administration. One question, I don't know if this is in the book, if you mention it. Obviously, you're focused on the economic populism on the left, but it would seem that at a certain point around that time when Ronald Reagan took over, when he won, his message to the American people was government isn't the solution, it's the problem. Get government out of the way. I feel like that's probably one of the most important statements around the economy, much less our politics, and beliefs that still resonates today of our lifetime. What are your just thoughts around that, how that narrative and ideological shift about government being the problem? Because if you don't have government, we saw what happens. If you don't have regulations and regulators, we saw what happens. A lot of people, that's how I see it. It's that simple to me, but maybe I'm missing.
I completely agree. And not only that, I think it shaped the framing of American politics for the next 30, 40 years going forward. Because what happens, and this is part of the history I cover in the book after Carter. When Carter lost, Democrats just kind of had a mass panic and wound up just adopting essentially like the Reagan outlook, the idea that government is the enemy. We should fall back and defer to kind of these free markets. And on top of that, Democrats as a party were kind of stuck then, right? Since the 1930s, 1940s, they'd been the party of labor. That was their kind of organizing muscle. Labor drove out the vote. Labor on the ground helped kind of organize different electoral coalitions, get people to the polls, and also just funded a lot of the dollars that went into the Democratic Party. And by the time you get to 78 and Carter in the early 80s, labor is in such steep decline that they just don't have the resources to do for the Democratic Party what they had been able to do back in the 50s, 60s. And so, you have Democrats kind of nervously looking around. They see Ronald Reagan. They realize they're in this new age of television. They kind of think to themselves, oh, shit, how are we going to compete and how are we going to pay for this? And that's when the party first began turning to Wall Street. One of my characters in the book, a now, I think, mostly forgotten guy, but just a pivotal historical figure, was the DCCC chairman, a California congressman named Tony Coelho, who was just this fanatical fundraiser, fascinating character, but went around and basically came up with this idea. It was sort of brilliant but perverted that, all right, we're not going to get our money from labor. I'm going to go shake down all of these Wall Street guys, all these business guys for money. And I'm going to take that money and I'm going to build what Reagan and the Republicans have, which is this kind of small dollar fundraising organization. And that's the way that we're going to organize the Democratic Party going forward to produce enough money to go on TV and run these ads and get telegenic candidates to compete with Ronald Reagan, guys like Walter Mondale. But it wound up being a sort of devil's bargain, if you'll pardon the term, because what it did was it got Democrats in bed with Wall Street, at first for money, but later on for policy, for ideas, for personnel. And I think Wall Street largely wound up kind of capturing the party in a way that turned out to be very detrimental, not just for Democrats, but for the country as a whole.
The financial industry, every special interests, good ones, bad ones, they lobby for different policy changes. And it's easy to follow things around what we're asking for to decrease gun violence, or even issues of climate change or women's reproductive rights or healthcare even, which is pretty confusing. But still, you can kind of understand because you deal directly with your insurance and your doctor. It's a little easier to understand. What Wall Street lobbyists were lobbying for years and continue to, it's confusing. It's hard to understand. I don't know how it affects me, which is why I bought a house when I did and got completely fucked.
Yeah, and that's the thing that's so insidious about special interest lobbying, is that most of it takes place behind the scenes. Most of it, I know this is kind of a Washington reporter who kind of sees this stuff up close. Most of it are these tiny little changes to the tax code that ordinary people, guys like you and me, would not know about, think about, care about, even understand. Some subclause of this kind of financial regulatory thing. We're just going to kind of tweak it to allow a little bit more derivatives, a little bit more option trading, take the limits off this, shift the regulator for being the SEC to some kind of weaker organization. And, collectively
somehow buy out the credit agencies or influence them to not do their job when the last
resort. Oh, yeah. Exactly. That's part of it, too. It's not just lobbying to rewrite laws. It's like, let's get this friend of the industry put in charge of the SEC, and they'll do our bidding from the inside. All of this stuff happens and happened. And you don't realize that, it leads to catastrophic consequences until that catastrophe is on top of you. I mean, to me, and this is sort of the uber thesis of the book, the great tectonic shift in American politics in my lifetime was the 2008 financial crisis, not just because of the crash and all the chaos it caused, but because in the aftermath of that crash in 2009, it's not like Democrats rose up and said, oh my God, we made a horrible mistake. We're going to ship these guys out of here and bring in some reformers like Elizabeth Warren. The same team that kind of screwed up the party on the front end was given the responsibility for handling the recovery and the bailout.
Yes, I remember. That's the most. And
in some ways, they succeed. I want to give them credit, so all my centrist Democratic Wall Street friends don't come stomp on me. We did avoid a second Great Recession, and that's an achievement. Obama saved the auto industry. That was a really important one. But by and large, the middle class was not bailed out, didn't get help. We had 7 years of austerity, and like the aftershocks from that earthquake are still out there today. To me, like that's been the real kind of like meta influence on American politics.
I so
on the
agree
left
with you.
right.
I don't know
people
how
just
to
don't talk about it enough.
I don't know how to make it a bigger deal than to just have people buy and read your book to understand it. But it's a book, like it's a book about an issue, about a movement, and it's so important. And that's why I was so excited to see that you had done this deep dive and written it. But it's also worth just underscoring what you said. I mean, again, I covered the transition from Bush into Trump, and I remember the fight. When it came to economics, it was the progressive economists who, frankly, many of which had been right or closer to predicting what would happen if you deregulated the financial industry. People lesser known like Dean Baker and more well-known people like Joseph Stiglitz and Jeffrey Sachs and even Paul Krugman, they were listened to for a minute and then they were pushed aside, if you ask them directly, which I have, by Obama and the transition team, and they brought in the old guard like Larry Summers and Tim Geithner and even the, as they called them at the time, the Rubinites. And you write a lot about Bob Rubin, his influence as Treasury Secretary and before, which I didn't know. And so that was an inflection point when I think the Obama administration went in the direction of the more, conservative, traditional guys who arguably helped get us in the problem, as opposed to the guys who saw the issue and had better solutions. That was my read. Am I right about that, Ish?
Yeah, I think you are. I mean, the thing that kind of jumped out to me, like the little kind of nugget from my research and reporting on this period was, WikiLeaks did that huge email dump back in, 15, 16 to kind of screw Hillary Clinton. But buried in those emails, there was a lot of kind of back and forth from the early days of the Obama transition. And you literally had a guy named Mike Froman, who was a Citibank executive, working from his Citibank email. These are emails that got linked. So, people can go and read them, or they can just like look in my book index or something. And he's literally going out hiring for the Obama administration from his Citigroup email, hiring Wall Street guys, hiring bankers. I mean, if anything could kind of, amplify the fact that like this was a bailout led by and designed for primarily Wall Street banks that not out of any kind of inherent evilness, but just because of kind of who they were and what their priorities were, was not going to be focused on middle-class homeowners. Like this helps to explain it. And, there were guys, as you say, even some that stuck with the Obama, the Obama administration, guys like Jared Bernstein, who was Biden's big economics guy when he was VP, is in the White House now. Yeah. They were there fighting the good fight, pushing for this stuff. But like it took another 8 years. And I think the election of Donald Trump for the realization to prevail upon Democrats that, wait a minute, we've done something badly wrong here. We need to change tack, and we need to kind of listen to these populists that are trying to push a more middle-class focus, as Biden calls it now, like a middle-out recovery. And I think one of the bits of good news in the book, since we've been dumping on kind of circa 1980, 2008 Democrats, is that you can see the positive effects in this, because the book is bookended by two financial crises, the big one in 2008 that starts the book, and then the COVID crash. Right. And Biden's reaction to the COVID crash and Democrats' reaction was just complete 180 degrees different than what it was back in 2008. And if you see the results today, we recovered all the jobs in 2 years instead of 7 years. Unemployment levels are like what they were during the Eisenhower administration. We've got tons of new factories coming in, job growth through the roof, stock market record high, inflation coming down, gas prices coming down. Like, obviously, this is not translated into robust support for Joe Biden, but just as a simple kind of like economic comparison of kind of the well-being of America generally and the American middle class.
But I would,
if you compare the response now to then, I mean, it's just night and day.
You can't compare the responses, though. And you're going to probably argue with me, but I'm going to try to split a hair here, which is when Obama became president, I believe those first couple months, we were losing 700, 800,000 jobs. The economy was destroyed. It was definitely why he beat John McCain. I think arguably is the economy was in such bad shape. Bush had no idea what he was doing, and so on. And then the attitude then was by Republicans, Mitch McConnell, do nothing to help him succeed. Do nothing. And so there was nothing that he could have done, even if they had wanted to. And you may argue they didn't suggest other than bailing out the banks. It happened quick. There was a lot of pressure. But could they have paid off mortgages? Could they have just directly given people the money? The difference was, as it always seems to be, it's bad if Democrats do it, but it's okay when Republicans do it, even when it's entirely wrong and doesn't work. COVID, the response was to just give people directly money. Once Trump did that the first time,
because who was in the White House, right? A Republican.
It was okay for a Republican to do it. It then became okay for Biden, or we became more used to, because and we also saw that it worked. You knew every economist knew it would have worked, probably a lot of them back in 2008 too. But the difference was that Trump did it first. That's why Biden could do it. That's why Obama never could. What do you think?
So two responses to that. One is on the Republicans.
One is you're a shithead, Pete.
One is, I thought that was baked into the cake. Okay. One is on the Republicans. Look, absolutely right on this. Nobody's given Republicans a pass. And I do kind of get into some of this history in the book, even though it's focused on Democrats. But, the great example to me in 2008 was Mitch McConnell, who, let's remember, George W. Bush was president, when the economy first started collapsing.
Yeah.
And
John McCain was the candidate who said the fundamentals of the economy are sound. Sorry to interrupt you.
Exactly. Not such a sharp economic mind, John McCain. But look, Bush was president, and when the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP, AKA the Wall Street bailout, was first passed, the guy who helped organize it on the Republican side, and after it passed, said it was one of the most important achievements of his political career, was Mitch McConnell. The difference was, once Barack Obama became president, the important achievement that McConnell passed was no longer interesting to McConnell, and in fact, he wanted to kind of starve and bleed the American people of the support that they were going to get, or that they needed, as a political measure. In fact, McConnell told this to me directly at the time. He said, Mike, I did a profile of him. He said, my goal is to make Obama a one-term president. Well, but to your other point about, the Obama's people's hands were tied. There's nothing they could have done. I don't agree. Number one, first, because the original purpose of that TARP money, the bailout money, was supposed to be for the Treasury to take that money, give it to banks, and in concert with the Treasury, go in and fix people's mortgages. Like, essentially, this would be directed at middle-class homeowners, and the Treasury would do this so that politicians didn't kind of get their hands dirty, but they were going to go in and fix this middle-class mortgage problem. Well, as soon as the money got into the Treasury, they kind of changed their mind. And Hank Paulson says, and I go through this in the book, look, we realized that we didn't have time to do that. Global economy was about to collapse. So we took all the money we gave to the banks. So okay, look, the problem is with that kind of a bailout, if you take all your money, the whole big pile of it, and you kind of shove it all over to the banks, there's nothing left for people on the middle class. And partly because the recovery in Geithner's plan depended so much on building confidence in the banks, it meant that Democrats and Obama couldn't lean on them, couldn't whack them. They had to kind of constantly be deferring to these banks who were taking all of our taxpayer money and not helping people in the middle class. I mean, to me, look, obviously it's tough to govern in the middle of a crisis. I think Obama did the best he could, but the middle class didn't get the help that they needed to. And I was embedded with Geithner. I mean, I could tell that he thought what he was doing was right, but Geithner's not a guy who's kind of walking the neighborhood like your local Paul every day and knows that Mr. Smith, isn't doing so great on his mortgage, and that, Pete Dominick stupidly bought a house, not realizing that the economy was going to crash, might need some help. And so those kinds of people were neglected and kind of pushed to the side until the backlash became, so loud and so palpable that they couldn't be ignored anymore. And, certainly the story of American politics since Trump got elected kind of woke everybody up to that anger, is that we're going to have to do something about this. And so you see with the COVID crash, what's the first thing everybody does, including Republicans, is they rush in and they do all the things they didn't do last time around.
Right.
Boom. Here's a big, $1.5 trillion stimulus. Oh, and we're also going to have these beefed up unemployment benefits, and we're not going to let your landlord evict you, and we're going to freeze your student loan payments. And they're out there doing all of the things that Elizabeth Warren had suggested Obama do back in 2009 and didn't do. Now suddenly everybody's got like the Elizabeth Warren poo-poo platter, and they're kind of pulling out these different policies, throwing them all at the problem. And guess what? It mostly worked.
Let's talk about the players as you do. We're almost out of time here. I haven't even gotten to this. You two, a deep dive. I mean, to me, Bernie Sanders was always in the right morally and ethically and economically, but it was more broad strokes. And I used to listen to go on with Tom Hartman, and they'd get into the nitty gritty of tax policy, of course, because they would go on like every Friday. They would get nerdy and no one would listen, but a few of us crunchy liberals. But when Elizabeth Warren came into the scene, it was like she understood more than anybody and was able to kind of explain, even as confusing as it was, what had happened, why it had happened, and how to fix it. Talk to me about kind of their influence on each other, or wherever you want to pick up as I finish the statement right now.
So Elizabeth Warren's superpower is being able to talk about really complicated financial regulations in a way that seems normal and easily accessible and like total common sense. And the other ingredient for Warren's rise is, people forget about this, but she was an early star of social media. Like back when nobody knew what YouTube was, it was all piano playing cats and that sort of thing. Warren was going on there and making the direct-to-camera videos, explaining the bailouts, explaining what people were doing wrong. Later on, she was doing these kind of beatdowns in congressional hearings of villainous bankers that weren't helping people in the middle class. And this stuff was starting to go viral on Twitter, which was also brand new. And so she really helped give rise to this whole kind of social media movement and politics kind of built around lefty politics. It's been so important and kind of built up what used to be called the Elizabeth Warren wing of the Democratic Party. But when she chose not to run for president in 2014, there were a couple of draft movements. I'm sure you remember. But when she decided not to do that challenge.
Yeah.
Were you all right?
Oh, I mean, I was always has been supportive of her. I mean, I was at the Daily Show. I worked at the Daily Show when she was on, and you write about that in the book. It put her on the map.
Huge part of the rise of lefty politics was the fact that Jon Stewart loved Elizabeth Warren, made her into a national celebrity outside kind of just the nerdy boundaries of Washington, and was kind of broadcasting every night that kind of Warren brand of politics to this hugely influential viewership. I mean, it definitely helped change American politics. And then when she didn't run, somebody needed to fill that void. And Bernie, who'd been out there saying these things for years and years and years and mostly being ignored, kind of stepped into that void and, took it to a whole nother level by like immediately becoming, went from being this kind of gadfly that only kind of people in Washington really knew or paid any attention to suddenly this kind of celebrity political candidate with stadium rallies that had this passionate following, who wound up raising and spending more money in the Democratic primaries than even Hillary Clinton did. I think that stamped, into Democratic politics, the fact that this kind of left populism was here to stay and was something that the broader party was going to have to adopt. And I think to Joe Biden's credit, he recognized that when he ran, and especially when he became president. And he's done a fairly good job of it.
Yeah, I want to talk about him quickly, but just Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez comes in and knocks off a guy, Joe Crowley, who a lot of people thought was going to be the next Speaker of the House. He was, and why was that? And will she run in 2028?
She's
if we still have an America.
If we still have an America, if we still have elections, she's kind of the product of all the forces I write about in the first third of the book, right? Millennial, graduates from college into the recession, unemployed, no insurance, shitty service industry jobs, unhappy about it, discovers Bernie, is inspired to run for office. And, also turns out to be a fantastic communicator, really good politician and organizer, and wound up knocking off Joe Crowley, the guy that we in Washington all expect to be the next Democratic Speaker. So, I mean, to me, her importance is kind of generational, and to just not be a wuss and duck your question, just tackle it straight on. I do think that she's going to run for president. I guess in 2028, we'll have to see. Technically, she could have run in 2024 because she turns 35 like 3 weeks before the election. And so, if she wanted to, she could have challenged Biden. But as I've said before, I think Warren, Bernie, and AOC all recognize that Biden has done a lot to enact their agenda, so they're not looking to challenge him. Nobody is. But I do think that really the only path for AOC to rise in Democratic politics is going to be to run for president. Because I don't know that she could win statewide office in New York, either as governor or as senator. And, being in the minority in the House of Representatives is like not a fun job, not a fun lifestyle. And at the very end of the book, as I say, like everybody in Democratic politics is so old and they're all going to be gone in a couple of years because they're going to retire or die off. She's not old, so she will still be around and certainly stands to kind of inherit the mantle of left populism that Warren and Bernie carried before.
And the whole new guard of Democrats. So there's so many young, influential Democrats who I think are pretty good people as far as politicians. And I'm just talking about in the House, not to mention in my state and where I live. I feel like there's a bright future for it. But I guess lastly, I know I got to let you go, but I mean, the bottom line is it would seem, and it depends on what progressive activist or pundit or politician you ask, that Joe Biden and the Biden administration have been the most progressive of our lifetime, and the policies that they've actually passed and advocated for openly, whether or not they pass them, have been very, very progressive. And you don't see a huge split amongst the activist class and the progressive movement along the lines of economic policy. I mean, we can talk where that is. It's more about, cultural, generational stuff maybe. But what do you think about, you write about it, obviously, look at the Biden administration.
Absolutely. How many people remember that Biden in the State of the Union address last year proposed a billionaire's tax? Like the idea that Joe Biden, whose nickname when I came to Washington was Senator from Corporate America because he was so pro-business, so pro-Wall Street, would propose a billionaire's tax, and embrace all of these lefty economic policies. It kind of boggles the mind. To me, the thing that summed it up, I talked to some folks in the Biden White House for the book, and one of them said to me, I said, how much influence do guys like Bernie and Warren have? Is it just for show or and he said, look, the people that gave us headaches, the Democrats that gave us headaches in the White House were Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema. Yeah. Nobody had a problem with Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And by the way, half the people in the administration are kind of ex-Warren, ex-Sanders people. So, you don't have to look. Warren always said personnel is policy. Well, take a look at Joe Biden's personnel. And I think you can kind of see the extent of the influence and just the sea change that we've seen in Democratic politics over the 15 years since the financial crisis.
Oh, I don't think most people know that. That personnel.
We'll have to buy the book and read it.
There you go. Buy the book and read it. By the way, the one thing that irked the shit out of me that Adam Carolla said to you is, he was, everything he said, he kept calling Biden a race baiter hustler, and clearly you didn't want to go down that road with him. But I just thought, to me, when he talks about, he was trying to criticize who's honest and who's not politicians. And I bring him up because a lot of people make this argument, and it just really bothers me that if a Democratic politician happens to be wealthy, happens to have made a lot of money, oftentimes like Bernie, I think off a book, and others who can buy a couple houses or something. They're not obscenely wealthy. They're wealthier than most of us. But as long as they're advocating for policies that wouldn't help them, as you said to Adam Carolla, Bernie Sanders is advocating for higher taxes on himself. So I hate the juxtaposition of, they're all wealthy and so they're being disingenuous. No, if you are a Democrat and you're advocating for policies that would punish you, or if you're a wealthy person, there's a lot of wealthy billionaires, you don't hear from them very much though, or wealthy people that want higher taxes on their class. They think it's wrong. They're actually advocating. That's why I always look at like a George Soros. The guy's constantly advocating for things that wouldn't necessarily benefit him economically. And yet people say that the system's rigged by those people. No, they would penalize themselves economically with the policies that they themselves pass. Do I have that narrative, generally speaking, right when it comes to Democrats?
Yeah, it's kind of like a low grade kind of right wing cheap shot debater point, whatever you're making an argument. In the flip side of that is that, guys like Trump who are worth or used to be worth, billions, went to Ivy League schools, are trying to pass themselves off as kind of friend of the working man populists, even while, wildly cutting taxes and trying to take your insurance away. It's kind of part of the nonsense element of politics, but to me, what's most interesting about these characters is not like obviously their personal financial situation, which I'm sure is better than mine, but like not really that important in the grand scheme of things. And the fact that they have changed the contours of the Democratic Party, changed what the Democratic Party stands for, to the extent that the senator from corporate America, Joe Biden, is proposing like a billionaire's wealth tax. I mean, that's something, if you could teleport back to like 1985 and tell Democrats that's what they'd be for, their jaws would drop. But because, this isn't about Trump and it's not about a culture war fight, I think most people don't really know and appreciate it. And it's kind of such an important part of our history. And it's such an important part of like even what Biden is doing today that doesn't make it onto social media or, onto cable news or things like that. And it's really what the election is going to be fought over. Are we going to go with Biden's version of left-wing populism, or are we going to go with Trump's version of right-wing populism? And I think the outcome is just going to have profound effect on the country.
Yeah, for sure. It already has in so many different ways. And you cover so much of it and explain so much of it in the book, which is why everybody should go get it. Go get it now. It's out and available. The Rebels, Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and Struggle for a New American Politics. Such great journalism. Congratulations, Joshua. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope you'll join me again for this book and whatever hell else you're writing about and reporting on. Good stuff.
Anytime, Pete. It's great doing it. Glad you had me on. Thanks again.
All right, there he goes, Joshua Green. Go let him know. He's on Blue Sky. He's on Twitter still. That you heard him here. That would be a big deal. He's the first time he's been on the show. So please go over there and say hello and tell him thanks. You know who you are. You always do it. Maybe if you haven't, maybe you could. Man, maybe just create a social media account just to thank the guests here on the show. There's all kinds of things you can do to support me and the work that I do every day, but the best thing you can do is sign up for a paid subscription, patreon.com/Pete Dominick. You can write a review on Spotify or iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or subscribe on YouTube if you want to watch this interview with Joshua Green. I just posted that up there yesterday. Get the book, The Rebels. It's very, very good. I wasn't just saying that. I don't just say it. And I hope that you listen tomorrow when I have Jerry Colonna, who is a pretty big deal, smart thinker, on to talk about his new book. Very much looking forward to that. And that's all I've got for you. So I hope to see you in Vegas. Go check out the ticket link. Join us in March 22nd and 23rd. And that's all I've got until tomorrow. Be the change you want to see, folks. John Carroll is taking us out every day.
Open up the window to let in some light. You gotta stand up. That's right. You got to rise up. You got to stand up. You got to stare the devil straight in the eye. We got to let him know it's his turn to go. See it clear when all you hear is a lie. Don't get up off of your butt, get down off of your fence. Even if it ain't a very friendly audience, well, they'll begin to listen when you start making sense. And you stand up. Stand up. No need to point your rifle to defend your town. Just stand up. Stand up. You know they can't deny you what you're laying down. Oh, you better stand up. Stand up. Show your face of every color, yellow, black, red, and brown. This is the place where every lost child will finally be found. There's only one thing to do before we stand our ground, and that's stand up. Stand up. Well, the founding fathers saw a land for all. They had to stand up. They had to stand up. They had a keen imagination for a crystal ball, drawing all the plans of a stand up. But all they had to go on was the time they were in, with other causes for laws, and since they weren't in sin, they knew that change was gonna come before the change could begin. They had to stand up. All right, they had to stand up. We got to stand up. We got to look the devil square in the eye. We got to let him know it's his time to go, and make it clear when all we hear is a lie. Why you lying awake wondering where the money all went? It'll be the cost of freedom that'll go unspent. You can see him flee the scene of that experiment if you stand up. All right. We got to speak up, we got to reach up, and raise your voice in every way you know how. Don't be toes up, you got to show up. Ain't no better time to do it but now. No need to pledge allegiance to no wanton tribe. Rise up, show obedience to the voice inside, and listen well and it'll tell you not to run and hide. It says stand.